a tricky thing. I really do think that it depends on how closely you're looking. That when you're standing further away somehow, it looks more stage-like. When you're really looking at the details, it seems to happen more gradually. To some extent, I think that makes sense within Piaget's framework, which is that the shift from one stage to another is a reorganization. So it's not that there's new information, but that the information gets reorganized. So it makes sense that there might be pieces of it before a child moves to the next stage, but that the coordination and the sense-making is lagging behind, even though they know some pieces of it. So there is a lot of research on training children also. You can train children to do better, to do, for instance, these conservation tasks earlier, or the 3 mountain task earlier. But there are problems in this training, such as if you turn around and say, I was just joking, that's not true, they're kind of okay with it. Where if you try to do that with an older child, they'll just think you're nuts. If you say, no, the amount of water did not change. I don't know what you're saying. I don't know who you think you're trying to fool. But the amount of water hasn't changed. Whereas the children who've gone through the training are much more malleable. They'll let you talk them back into the wrong answer. It also does, if they might learn the water one, then they can't do it with the coins or with the clay. So there's no transfer of it. In fact, transfer of knowledge is a huge problem. In general, what you learn in one class is very hard to transfer to another class or to transfer outside of school. It's a real problem. And having worked with mentally retarded adults, it's even harder for them. They can learn how to cook in their kitchen, but take them to another kitchen and they'll have no idea where to start because they're so concrete to the specific pots and pans. They don't know how to, they have a much more difficult time than average people in making sense of it elsewhere, if that makes sense. The real thing I want to get to, and it's going to get us into the next theory, however, is how culture and education really does influence this. One of the tests, and I can't remember if I told you this before, so I'm just going to repeat myself if I did, but one of the tests of the formal operational stage is it's to ask a sort of a riddle. So there's a couple of riddles that I typically use in class. Joe builds a house on the North Pole. It's exactly on the North Pole. And he looks out the window. What direction is he looking? Anybody? It's a riddle. Once you think it, it'll be obvious. So you're standing exactly on the North Pole. What direction are you looking? You can't look north because you are north. South. There's only one direction to look when you are standing exactly on the North Pole. It has to be south. Does everybody understand that? I don't know how to explain the logic. Well, the thing is that younger children don't get it. They'll believe you, but they don't understand it. Now, you're standing there on the North Pole and you see a bear. What color is the bear?
White.
Why? Because you're in the North Pole, so all they have are polar bears, right? So they have to be white. Again, children might believe you, but they're not going to be able to figure it out. They don't see the logic of it. Well, it turns out that in the 70s, people started going around the world and asking indigenous people, meaning people who've never gone to school, who often live in some sort of tribal, non-industrialized community. And they would give the same response as younger children. They'd say, well, I don't know Joe. You'd have to ask Joe. I can't speak for Joe. I don't know what Joe experienced. I don't know what Joe saw. You can't ask me. Go talk to Joe. And as they were testing this, they discovered that this was the norm among indigenous people. And they began testing other things. And in general, indigenous people, as it turns out, think more like the children in the concrete operational stage. So they never arrive at formal operational thinking. Well, this became a big problem. And I will tell you more about that research in a little while. Another issue came up that, and I don't have a reference on this one. I keep forgetting to ask the person who told me this about this research, and I've looked it up and I can't find it. It's old enough. But back in the 70s, when a lot of this work was going on, it was found that children in Harlem tended to be lagging a little bit behind other kids. They weren't moving to concrete operational stage at the same time, and so people started testing it. One study that was done was where a researcher played a little videotape for the kids, for half of the kids. So half of the kids did the conservation tasks exactly like all the others. The other half first watched a videotape where they said, watch out for Joe Trickster, he's gonna get you, don't let him trick you, don't let him fool you, Joe Trickster's out to get you. Some little commercial type thing. And then Joe Trickster comes in, who is the experimenter, but he's dressed in some sort of costume or something. And he says, all right, you see these glasses of water? Are these the same or are they different? And the children say, well, they're the same. All right, now watch this. I'm gonna pour this water into this tall, thin one. Now, is there the same amount of water or are they different? Now, the children from Harlem did it exactly the same way as most children. That is, those under 7 got it wrong, those over 7 got it right. Whereas in the control group, where the same person, but now dressed in like a white lab coat or something like that, does the experiment, now children are older, around 8 on average, let's say, before they'll give the right answer. So what's going on that's different here? The way the person is dressed? Why would that make a difference in their ability to think logically?
Because they probably, I don't know, because Joe the Trickster seems more so friendly and kid play, whereas someone in Lab Corp seems more serious, so they're probably like, you probably know what's right, so.
So why would Harlem kids be more susceptible to that than other kids? Okay. Well, what's your guess?
No, because you said in the beginning they told them not to listen to Joe the Trickster. So they're going to probably, like, they're kids. As soon as you put something in their mind, they're going to stick to it because they don't know any better.
So they're on guard with Joe Trickster, but with the experimenter in normal clothes.
They think more about the experiment than the guy presented to them.
Okay. What's the difference? Why would that make a difference for Harlem kids and not for other kids? I remember this was in the 70s. Harlem hasn't gone through the gentrification it has now. So it's pretty poor, very black. What's the difference here?
It could be from, they from Harlem, so they might want to listen to nobody in a lab coat. I don't know.
Well, let's think about the 1970s. Our experimenter, we can pretty much guess, is white. The kids are black. What are black kids in the 70s and before told about the way they need to treat white adults?
Whites were more superior, so they had to respect them and more so authority than any other race.
So they knew they had to really be on their best. They need to behave very properly. So do you think they might be a little more anxious? Well, the conclusion of this study, we don't know for sure what made the difference, but the conclusion of this study is that it's not that Harlem kids were more stupid or slower, developing more slowly than other kids, but that they were much more anxious around that experimenter. And that this led them, all kids we know want to give the right answer. This is just children, they want the approval of adults at this age. Once they're teenagers, it's another story. But 6 to 9, 5 to 9, they definitely want the approval of adults. So it's theorized that one of the issues here was that these black children were much more tense around white adults. They maybe had never talked to a white adult before, or at least not very much. They won't have had as much exposure, whereas white kids are around white adults all the time, right? At the same time, there is a cultural difference that often, in general, poor children, we'll talk more about this when we talk about parenting, are taught to just be obedient. You say, yes sir, no sir, and that's it, whereas middle-class kids are much more often taught to sort of be more like friends. You're allowed to contradict parents and teachers more. There's always limitations, but you don't have to necessarily agree. So it's thought that the culture and the racism of society is what made it harder for these kids. So what we begin to see here is that culture and education do make a big difference. And I will tell you more about that as we go along. But let me first tell you that these problems they began to discover led people to turn to the work of Lev Simonovich Vygotsky. Now, I am a Vygotskyan, so I'm going to try to convince you that this is the best way to do research. So here's an important thing to note when we start. He was born in 1896, died in 1934. He was born exactly the same year as Piaget. Piaget lived until 1980. Vygotsky died when he was only 37 years old of TB, or tuberculosis. So it was pretty common in those days. These days we have antibiotics, although there was some strands a few years back that were resistant to antibiotics. We seem to more or less have that under control now. So people in this country don't die of TB anymore, but they did in those days. Now, he died really young, which means that he didn't really finish developing his theory. This causes some problems. He also lived through the Soviet Revolution, which cut him off from the United States in a lot of ways. What's interesting is that he truly was a Marxist. Does everybody know who Karl Marx is? Yeah. Yes?
Sociologist.
Well,
Kind of, sort of.
a lot of sociologists talk about him. There's a lot more talk about Marx within sociology than within psychology. Karl Marx is often accredited with the creation of communism, although he didn't actually create the idea, but he certainly developed it. And one of the reasons that Marx isn't liked a lot in this country, because he created Marxism, although with the economy as it is, there's a lot more people talking about Marx than they used to. But Marx is not just about economics and politics. There's much more to his theory. And Vygotsky, and there's some disagreement on this, but it's mostly agreed on that Vygotsky was trying to create a Marxist psychology. It seems, though, that he had the wrong version of Marx, because there were different ideas of what Marx really meant. This is the problem when somebody dies, we all start disagreeing about what he really meant. And this led to different strands. Your textbook, the Crane book, talks about the problem being that he was dealing with intelligence tests, and it was the Soviet Union was opposed to intelligence testing because we don't want to look at how people are different. We want to talk about everybody's the same. And according to Crane,